They said the surface was lost to us forever. Even the word surface had become a distant, mythical concept, some boogeyman story you'd whisper about when the lights flickered and the ventilation system struggled. I had never felt the sun's warmth on my skin, nor heard the rustle of leaves in a breeze. All I'd ever known was the labyrinth beneath the earth, a city of endless corridors and claustrophobic tunnels. Down here, it was said, we were alive. It had been centuries, I heard in rumors, since anyone had tried to remain above, since anyone dared face the solar fury that scorched the landscapes like an unquenchable fire. They called our home the Deep Archaeologies, though we were taught another name when we were young, the labyrinth. Our daily life revolved around forging new tunnels, sustaining the few hydroponic gardens that still produced edible plants, and ensuring the enormous pumps kept the water supply uncontaminated. If anything broke, if any subsystem collapsed, every life down here was at risk. When I was small, I listened to the elders speak of how we came to live underground, of the storms that howled across the surface, capable of searing the flesh from bone in moments. I shivered in my bunk, pressing my palms over my ears to shut out the tales. Yet some part of me was fascinated too. I wanted to see a horizon, or at least to understand what it could have looked like. I wanted to feel sunlight, beam after beam, not the sickly glow of our fluorescent overheads. Most said I was a foolish dreamer. Why pine for something that existed only in story and memory? But in my heart, I believed all stories contained kernels of truth, like seeds waiting to sprout in the darkness. On the day my grandmother died, I was tasked with collecting her personal effects from her room. She'd been one of the eldest in our settlement, an unofficial historian who documented what little she remembered of the times before the Great Dissension. Her personal records included thick notebooks stuffed with brittle pages, sketches of trees, lakes, and sky, drawn from memory. These images had always entranced me. But what I found hidden in a secret pocket of her threadbare suitcase changed my life. It was a small journal, smaller than my palm, bound in cracking leather. Its pages were covered with my grandmother's tight scrawl. The sketches there were not whimsical or reminiscent. They were meticulous, annotated with coordinates, air density calculations, and slope measurement. It took me days of poring over the notes to realize what I was looking at. A hidden passage leading to an older labyrinth sector, deeper than any of the official maps indicated, a domain we had abandoned presumably due to structural instability or radiation. But my grandmother's final entries hinted at something else, a path upward to the remains of a surface entrance. Reading her words unmoored me from the daily monotony of life in the deep arch. For the first time, I had tangible proof that we, our ancestors, had once carved different paths, and there might still be a corridor heading closer to the surface. Though the solar storms above had not subsided, it was an opening, a link to the outside. That overcame what I'd always been told: never ascend. To ascend is madness. But if my grandmother had found a reason to map it, her instincts must have been grounded in something real. I took the journal to my friend Orion, a skilled mechanic who specialized in reactivating old tunnel lighting systems. Over the scrapes and whir of his workshop, I slid the journal across the metal counter. Can you make sense of these rations? Or these pressure differentials? He adjusted the magnifying goggles perched on his nose, scanning the pages. These sections are quite old. Could be decades, maybe centuries. But the pressure differentials are definitely a sign that she was measuring atmospheric flow from an older vent system. His eyes glimmered. You're not saying you want to check this out? I swallowed hard. Maybe. The labyrinth is failing, Ori. You've heard the alarms this week. Another portion of the water filtration system collapsed in Sector 7. Entire families have been forced to relocate. We can't rely on patching up a sinking ship forever. He lowered his voice. That's dangerous talk. The elders don't like negativity. But it's true, I said. We can't just sit and let the labyrinth decay around us. If we have a chance, any chance, to find something new, even if it means venturing closer to that nightmare on the surface, shouldn't we at least see if the path is viable? Orion exhaled slowly, worry etched into his expression. I'll help, but we must keep this in absolute secrecy. If word gets around, the elders might shred your grandmother's notes and confine you to quarters." It took 2 weeks of careful planning. We studied the labyrinth's known corridors, cross-referencing them with the cryptic lines in my grandmother's journal. She'd written in such a hurried style that deciphering her path was challenging. We deduced we'd need specialized protective gear in case of radiation pockets or structural collapses. Orion quietly salvaged scraps of plating from the mechanical bay to fashion us improvised suits. I honed my sense of direction until I could trace any path in my mind. We set out on a night shift, when most folks were either sleeping or isolated to their designated living areas. The hush that fell over the labyrinth corridors felt like a living entity pressing in on us. Our footsteps echoed softly as we turned corners, following the path laid out in the journal. At times, we had to squeeze through half-collapsed tunnels, heads brushing dusty pipes. We tried to stay calm, but the labyrinth's oppressive darkness threatened to overwhelm. Eventually, we reached a sealed door, so encrusted with rust and mold that prying it open took tremendous effort. Beyond it lay a sector that had obviously been abandoned decades ago, cut off from regular life in the deep arcologies. Eerie stillness ruled, broken only by the hiss of stale air slipping through broken vents. My heart pounded at every creak or rattle in these deserted passageways. In some corridors, flickering emergency lights sparked. In others, our headlamps were the only illumination. Doors hung ajar, revealing empty dorms, shattered windows, and rusted furniture. Whole families had once lived here, raised children, carried out daily routines. Now it was a grave of memory. Yet my grandmother's journal urged us on. Deeper, deeper. We reached a vertical shaft that soared upward into blackness. According to the coordinates, we had to ascend. Orion attached a handheld spool of rope to a defunct pipe. Step by step, we climbed the corroded rungs built into the shaft's inner wall. Dust and debris rained down with each movement. My arms trembled and my lungs felt short of breath, but an invisible force, hope, kept us going. It took hours, or so it felt, until we emerged into another corridor. This one, unbelievably, had intact lighting, albeit dim. Rusty signs with letters chipped away by time indicated something obscure. Surface access maintenance. The corridor angled sharply upward. Neither of us spoke, but we shared the same realization. This was a path once used by maintenance crews in the earliest days of the underground city, when they sealed the upper levels to prepare for permanent life below. We inched through the corridor, the air growing thinner and colder. Finally, we entered a wide chamber with a massive vault-like door at the far end, half embedded in the rocky ceiling. Several battered consoles lined the walls, each with long dead screens. Orion, always the mechanic, approached one, fiddling with old wires. He barked in excitement as a few lights flickered to life. These consoles might still have power, but it's minimal. Look for a breaker or an auxiliary generator switch. We swept the chamber until I found a buried panel under a collapsed beam. A few cables jutted out. One was labeled AUX-Gen. I flicked the switch, hearing a groan and a sudden hum that made the floor vibrate softly. Light sputtered across the ceiling, revealing the heavy door in its entirety. An ancient sign overhead read, "Caution, solar hazard." A mechanical hiss startled us as a secondary hatch halfway up the door shifted, letting in a piercing beam of light. My first instinct was to shield my face, but the beam wasn't hot. It was faint. The door was sealed so tightly that only a thin band of what must have been sunlight, filtered through decades of dust and grime, trickled into the corridor. My eyes welled with tears at the sight. A real sunbeam, no matter how pale. Orion pressed a console button marked door release. Gears shrieked in protest, resisting after eons without motion. Then, with a screech of metal, the massive barrier cracked open, leaving a wedge just wide enough for 2 people to squeeze through. The air that rushed in was shockingly cold, carrying with it sense of dust and dryness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Breaking a taboo didn't even begin to describe it. We had opened a door that our ancestors had sealed, believing that nothing but ruin lay beyond. We stepped through into a short tunnel that angled upwards, rough and earthen in places. Our headlamps flickered on the jagged walls. And then, In a moment so surreal I nearly dropped to my knees, we emerged into a world that was half buried in sand and rubble. A broken staircase rose in front of us, leading to a fractured metal walkway. Overhead, the gloom parted just enough for a pale orange glow to filter through. Our suits and masks beeped warnings about radiation levels and compromised air quality, but neither was lethal. I gazed around in swelling awe and fear, trying to assemble some coherent understanding of what I was seeing. The old city's remains surrounded us, rusted beams jutting like skeletal arms from mounds of debris. Above, swirling dust clouds glowed with the faint light from a sun hidden behind thick crackling storms. Indeed, the solar wind was a near-constant phenomenon, swirling across the planet's surface, scattering radioactive waves. Yet something was different from the old stories. The wind, while unnerving, did not peel our skin away. The protective flight suits we'd cobbled together were enough to block the brunt of the radiation. It was dangerous for prolonged exposure, but not instantly fatal. Could it be that the storms had changed? Cautiously, we ventured farther, stepping over twisted metal and shattered glass. Orion was scanning the environment with a handheld device, his eyes wide with equal amounts of dread and fascination. I found a vantage point atop a partially collapsed pillar. From that modest height, I caught sight of wide expanses choked with blackened sand, peppered with the outlines of buildings that had once stood tall. The sky above roiled with swirling red clouds, flares of energy that occasionally sparked across the horizon. I felt small, impossibly small, in the face of this wasteland. But I also felt something else, the fullness of breath, the real outside air, even if laced with toxins. Why did they abandon it all so completely? Orion asked softly. Yes, the solar fury is real, but I would have expected more devastation. Could it be that conditions have changed over the centuries? I shook my head. I don't know, but what if the labyrinth's central authority didn't want us to know? Maybe it was easier to keep everyone underground than risk partial exposure. We should gather data, show it to people, said Orion, excitement growing in his voice. We could prepare more advanced suits, build better shields, maybe even reclaim some resources. A swirl of dust made me cough. My suit's filters whirred, straining. We can't stay here long, I said. Radiation's going up and we're not exactly sure how stable that zone is. But despite the warning, I felt an undeniable yearning to linger. After all my life in cramped rock corridors, the wide open, even in ruin, felt intoxicating. We inspected a few battered buildings near our point of emergence. Inside one, we discovered shelves with rusted tins, ancient electronics, piles of brittle plastic containers. Another had collapsed into itself. The drifting sands had accumulated in every corner, forming dunes in what had once been living rooms or offices. We found no signs of survivors, only echoes of the past. Yet I cradled each artifact in my gloves, imagining the lives once lived above ground. With the data we collected in our suits nearing their limit, we finally returned to the passage, resealing the door. The labyrinth's stale air seemed strangely comforting after the tumult above. We crept back to Orion's workshop, numb from adrenaline and half disbelieving what we had witnessed. The labyrinth felt narrower, gloomier, now that we knew there might be a future on the surface if we dared to adapt. We decided the next step was to share our findings carefully, to see who might support us. We agreed on one person, Talia, a medical officer known for her empathy and open-mindedness. She listened in stunned silence as we recounted the expedition and showed her the radiation scans. She studied the data carefully, then stared at us as if we'd deciphered an impossible riddle. If you're telling me the truth, this changes everything, Talia whispered. We've always believed that solar storms made the surface uninhabitable. The elders have built an entire existence down here on that premise. If conditions have improved, if the storms are slightly weaker, we could eventually, perhaps, begin to re-establish above-ground presence. But do you realize how dangerous it will be to challenge centuries of dogma? I felt my chest tighten. We can't keep living in a labyrinth that's falling apart. We've seen entire sections cut off because of failing infrastructure. The water filtration's on the brink, Talia. She nodded, her expression grim and resolute. I'll help, but we need more proof. Solid proof that large-scale relocation is viable, if only partially. We'd also have to figure out how to protect people from higher radiation exposure. Do you have any idea how the elders might respond? Not well, Orion said quietly, but if we quietly gather a group of like-minded individuals, perhaps we can mount a second expedition. Bring back more compelling evidence, enough that the elders will be forced to acknowledge reality. Word spread slowly, but soon a small group formed around us. Engineers, explorers, a few disillusioned officials who recognized the labyrinth's decline. They donated resources quietly: sturdier suits, portable radiation shields, better climbing gear. We spent weeks meticulously preparing. Meanwhile, we heard rumors of people going missing as they tried to find new living quarters in the deeper labyrinth levels. The structure was failing. Time was short. Everything was set for our second expedition. This time we planned to travel deeper into the surface ruins, possibly crossing into adjoining city sectors to see if anything was salvageable. We wanted conclusive data, maybe even atmospheric samples that could demonstrate to the elders that, with the right gear, we could survive above ground for extended periods. It was risky, but so was staying below indefinitely. On the day we chose to depart, Talia joined us, her medkit stuffed with emergency supplies. We traced the same route Orion and I had used before, now more expertly navigated. When we passed through the monstrous vault door again, Talia paused, enthralled by the pale sunlight that dripped in through the cracked sky. "It's so strange," she murmured. "Not at all the instant lethal force we were taught. It's faint, but it's real." Outside, the wind howled. We pressed forwards, scanning for safer routes across the damaged cityscape. We crossed a half-buried arches trembling underfoot. We reached what had once been a massive plaza. Talia gasped at the sight of a battered statue, half its metal face melted away, the other half gazing skyward as if in lament. Radiation readings spiked occasionally, forcing us to detour around pockets of contaminated rubble, but the suit's reinforced plating held steady. Some in our group began collecting soil samples, scanning them for viability and future cultivation. The results were mixed, but not as dire as we had feared. There was hope in that alone. Then we found something we weren't prepared for. In the dark recess of what might once have been a subterranean transport station, we encountered an entire corridor where half-broken crates lined the walls. Inside them were seeds, thousands of them, vacuum-sealed in centuries-old containers that had miraculously survived. Wheat, corn, tomatoes, even fruit seeds. Talia's face lit with possibility. If these are still viable, the labyrinth's hydroponics would expand tenfold, or we could even attempt to plant them in controlled patches on the surface if we found a way. That discovery alone felt like a miracle. We carefully loaded as many sealed crates as we could carry. Some of us joked that if the labyrinth elders refused to believe us, maybe the seeds themselves would speak for the truth. But not long after, my chest tightened at a new sight. A swirl of intense fire in the distant horizon. A solar flare, larger and more volatile than anything we had yet seen, glowing ominously behind the swirling dust. The sky rumbled, as if some ancient beast had woken. "We need to retreat," Orion said, scanning the instruments. "Radiation levels are about to spike off the charts. These suits won't protect us from a direct storm of that magnitude." We scrambled back, hearts hammering. The winds picked up, swirling blackened sand in a blinding fury. We struggled to keep formation, stumbling over broken pavement, scrambled down half-buried corridors, and finally reached the vault door. By the time we sealed it behind us, my limbs were shaking, and at least 2 people had collapsed in exhaustion. Once inside, Talia checked us for acute radiation sickness, administering preventative meds. Thankfully, no one had lethal exposure, but we'd narrowly avoided disaster. The solar fury still reigned supreme in the heavens, but we had glimpsed the nuances behind that fury, moments of calm and small areas that could be reclaimed, if we approached them with caution and technology. Carrying the crates and the data logs, we returned to the inhabited corridors, hearts pounding not from fear alone, but from exhilaration at what we had discovered. Our group assembled in Talia's clinic, examining the seeds more closely. They were sealed in robust containers designed to withstand the worst conditions, likely from an old conservation effort. If we could replicate that technology, we might be able to store dozens of new seeds for eventual replanting. And we had the atmospheric data to show that, though still dangerous, the surface might be re-entered in carefully timed windows. Yet in the days that followed, we faced the labyrinth's greatest obstacle, the Council of Elders. Rumors of our surface expedition spread, and soon we were summoned for questioning. Some in the group were scared. The elders had historically banished or confined anyone who threatened social stability, but we had come too far to be silent. Standing in the council's chamber, I recounted the story. I described the corridor, the blasted city, the seeds, and the measurable changes in radiation patterns. One elder glowered at the mention of shifting solar winds, shaking her head as if I were speaking heresy, but others listened gravely. Talia stepped forward, presenting the scientific data. The environment remains hostile, but it is not instantly lethal. The labyrinth systems are failing, and indefinite survival is at risk. If we foster the right technology, improve suits, safer shelters, we can begin exploring the surface in designated intervals, reintroducing ourselves to the world above. Silence hung. An older elder who had remained quiet finally spoke. This labyrinth has sheltered us for centuries. We are taught that the outside world is death, that no good comes from ascension. But perhaps times are changing. If you truly have seeds that can grow, if the storms have weakened, he paused as though he feared his own words. We must at least examine the data. Not everyone approved. A faction of the council demanded that we seal the root permanently and destroy all evidence. But a slender majority, swayed by Talia's medical expertise and the seeds we'd recovered, agreed to form a specialized committee to research surface reclamation. They authorized a small expansion of our existing labs to begin testing the seeds, to replicate protective suits for eventual shifts above ground. It wasn't a triumphant victory. The labyrinth remained divided. Whispers spread that we had unleashed a dangerous curiosity that could doom everyone. Others whispered that we were the heralds of hope, the ones who might lead humanity back into the light. I found myself drifting between relief and uncertainty, never fully sure which side time would prove correct. Adding another layer of disquiet, the solar flares only seemed to be growing stronger in the short term. We heard warnings that a major storm might sweep across the planet soon. The elders insisted on halting all expeditions until that threat passed. Anxiety rippled through the labyrinth, magnified by the ongoing structural failures. In the weeks that followed as the next solar storm loomed, I found solace by rereading my grandmother's journal, running my fingertips across the scrawled notes that had led me on this journey. She must have been so courageous to explore these possibilities alone, back when speaking of the surface was tantamount to sin. Perhaps she had a vision that there would come a time when the labyrinth no longer sufficed and we would be forced to re-emerge or face extinction. That storm eventually arrived, shaking the ground with tremors even deep below the surface. Lights browning out, ventilation systems malfunctioning, panicked families huddled in the mightiest chambers. For a few terrifying hours, we all believed the labyrinth was about to collapse, burying us forever in darkness, but the structure held just barely. When the turbulence subsided, rescue teams scrambled to fix countless damaged systems. I joined them, pushing past exhaustion to help restore critical water lines. Over days of sweat and frantic repairs, a collective realization took hold among the people. The labyrinth had nearly failed. We couldn't keep risking our entire existence on crumbling infrastructure. In the aftermath, we approached the council again, urging immediate steps toward building a surface outpost. This time, more of them agreed. The partial meltdown of the labyrinth's support systems had shaken their confidence in indefinite subterranean life. They allocated resources to constructing an ascendant bunker, a pressurized radiation-shielded station at the vault door from which future expeditions could operate more safely. They also approved a research facility to study the seeds in controlled conditions. Slowly, the taboo around discussing the surface was chipped away. I wish I could say we all marched upward as one, victorious and unstoppable. But transformations, especially those rooted in centuries of conditioning, take time. Fear still lingered, caution still guided every plan, and many refused to believe the surface could ever be anything but lethal. Yet even that carefully measured progress felt monumental relative to the old dogma. There was light in the labyrinth now, a spark of possibility. It glinted in the eyes of the children who listened as we recounted stories of the open sky without shutting their ears in terror. Late one cycle, as I wandered near the old deserted corridors, I found Orion tinkering with a broken console. When he noticed me, he flipped down his goggles and grinned. I'm trying to redirect some of the labyrinth lighting to the upper corridor so it'll be safer for the next expedition. Also, I just found out Talia's seeds are sprouting in the test labs. Already? I asked, hope shading my voice. That's incredible. He nodded, a hint of awe crossing his face. A new beginning, hidden in tiny seeds. Kind of poetic, isn't it? I joined him, crouching beside the console, recalling how far we'd come. My grandmother's journal, the forbidden corridor, the corridor's vault door, that first taste of sunlight in a swirling, toxic sky, the horrifying flare that nearly killed us, and now, small green seedlings nourished by artificial lights below. An ascendant bunker in development, slow acceptance by the council. Beneath all the fear and caution, a new seed of humanity was taking root, one that recognized we could not remain sealed off forever. Someday, perhaps, we'd find ways to walk under the sun not in terror, but in cautious wonder. Perhaps, in time, we'd regreet the surface as a home, forging a fragile coexistence with the storms, building bunkers and shields, venturing out in phases. It wouldn't come easy, and it wouldn't come quickly, but the labyrinth's shadows no longer felt inescapable. A path had opened, and as I rose to help Orion with the wiring, that sense of possibility swelled in my chest, making the darkness just a little less suffocating. No one knew for certain what lay ahead. The surface might remain treacherous for generations, or we might discover some renewed balance. But at least we were no longer trapped by fear. We had glimpsed a world beyond the labyrinth, and that was enough to set everything in motion. Our future might be uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. It was time to climb out of the depths, to face the solar fury, and maybe, if we were brave and resilient enough, to one day stand under open skies again.